Okay, let's jump into something pretty fascinating today. We've got a real historical deep dive queued up, sent in by you, our listener.
Yeah, this one takes us back a bit.
It does. We're looking at a specific source from, wow, nearly a century ago.
That's right. It's an article from November 1928, published in the Builder magazine. And the title, well, it doesn't pull any punches. What's the Matter with Freemasonry?
Yeah, straight to the point.
It's by a brother named Herbert Hungerford. And he actually introduces it as, like, the first in a series. That the whole point was supposed to be internal reflection, critique within the fraternity.
And he really doesn't hold back, does he? He calls them outspoken articles of critical analysis and constructive suggestion.
Hmm.
His stated goal was basically to challenge Masons to see,
Yeah.
two sides of their institution, even if, and he actually says this, it might shock, perhaps pain some folks.
Right. The whole idea was self-examination, trying to improve things from the inside.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of hoping that if they did the correcting themselves, maybe harsh external judgment would be less likely.
Makes sense. He kicks things off right away by asking the reader, how does this question strike you?
Yeah, like, does the implication that there may possibly be something the matter with Masonry instinctively arouse an attitude of resentment? It's a direct challenge.
It really is. It forces you to check your own reaction immediately. And he anticipates the different ways people might react, right? Like, some people might just get defensive straight away.
Totally. The Caesar's wife mindset, he calls it. The feeling that Masonry should be above suspicion and beyond reproach. Perfect.
Or you could be on the other end, part of what he calls the anvil chorus, maybe hoping for a ripping up of the issues.
And then there's the third group, maybe the saddest one, simple indifference. He noticed that, particularly among inactive members, just didn't care either way.
And he actually says that the fact these reactions exist, especially that defensiveness, kind of proves his point and justifies writing the series.
Exactly. He brings up this whole sacred cow attitude, this idea that criticizing from within is somehow disloyal.
Oh yeah, quoting that old saying, it's a bad bird that befouls its own nest.
But he pushes back on that pretty hard. He argues, look, Masonry is a gloriously human institution. It's not some perfect, untouchable thing.
Not sacrosanct.
Right. And he sees constructive criticism not as being disloyal, but as a great stimulus for progress and growth. He even ties it to the acacia symbol.
Oh, that was interesting. How did he frame that?
Well, he suggests the evergreen doesn't just mean individual immortality, but that the institution itself should be always living and ever growing, which implies it needs to change, adapt, improve. It's not static.
Wow, using the acacia that way, that's a powerful interpretation. It makes critique seem almost natural, part of its life. So our mission then for this deep dive is to unpack the specific criticisms that Brother Hungerford laid out back in 1928. What were the big issues Masons were wrestling with internally almost 100 years ago?
Absolutely. And the first major thing he dives into, it connects right back to, well, arguably the core stated purpose of Freemasonry itself.
Which would be character building, right?
Precisely. So he asks, pretty bluntly, to what extent is membership today improving morals, unbuilding character? He says it's a fair question because character building is supposed to be the main goal.
Okay, so why was he asking? What evidence did he offer?
Well, he shares some anecdotes kind of illustrating the external perspective. There's that story about the Will Rogers oil well shooter who was known for being a heavy drinker.
Right.
Apparently, someone asked him if he was a Shriner or a Knight Templar or a Mason. And the guy supposedly replied, "No, sirree, I'm just an ordinary drunkard."
Ouch. That's biting.
Hungerford calls it a sly dig at shortcomings, very generally supposed to be typical. A subtle jab, but pointed.
Yeah, you could say that. He also mentioned a letter, didn't he?
He did. A letter sent to Dr. S. Parks Cadman, who was the Grand Chaplain of New York, then asking, basically, why the writer knew so many Masons who seemed like intemperate and dissolute characters, even though the fraternity claims these high moral principles.
What was the official response?
Well, Dr. Cadman, in his reply, defended the craft, saying individuals like that were just rare exceptions.
The standard defense, maybe? But Hungerford himself, where did he land on this?
He seemed, well, more inclined to agree with the critics, at least partly. He says this criticism about bibulous brethren, brothers who drink too much, is quite common, and maybe, he adds, fairly well justified.
So he wasn't buying the rare exceptions line entirely.
Not completely. He's careful he doesn't say Masons are less temperate than anyone else. But he definitely felt the fraternity falls far short of actually living up to its own teachings on this stuff.
And what about the counter-argument you sometimes hear that Masonry isn't a reform school?
Oh, he tackles that head on, calls it a threadbare response, just worn out.
A threadbare.
Because, he points out, lodges do supposedly guard their entrances. They inquire into a candidate's character before letting them in. There's a vetting process.
Right, so there is an expectation of character from the start. It's not like they're taking just anyone.
Exactly. So the idea that they have no responsibility for members' character doesn't really hold up for him. And he brings it back to the ritual, too.
How so?
He says, basically, if the ritual doesn't clearly state the moral objective, if it doesn't instill plain principles of morality, aiming for the betterment of its members and the advancement of all humanity, well, then he says he's been sadly mistaught as to the meaning of the English language.
Wow, that's a strong statement. It's like questioning the very effectiveness of the core teachings if this behavior persists.
It really is. And that critique about whether the ritual actually works in practice seems to lead him right into his next point. This one's more about the ritual experience itself from a kind of psychological perspective.
Ah, okay. This is criticism number 2. Does ritualism menace morality by substituting emotion for effort? This sounds intriguing.
Yeah, he calls it a psychological criticism of ritualism. And he says it's not just about Masonry, but applies to any group where ceremonies are, a big deal.
Okay, so what's the core psychological principle he's talking about?
He uses a religious parallel. It's the same idea as be ye doers of the word, not hearers only.
Got it. Hear the message, but then you have to actually do something.
Right. The psychological argument is that people who get really into creeds and ceremonials can sometimes, maybe unconsciously, blur the lines between words and deeds.
How do you mean?
Like the act of reciting the ritual or just participating can create such a strong feeling that you've done something worthwhile, a worthy work. But that feeling might potentially replace the need to actually do the hard work of living those principles out in the real world.
Ah, okay. So the emotional high or the intellectual satisfaction from the ritual becomes an end in itself instead of a motivator for action. Like feeling virtuous just by attending without changing behavior outside the lodge.
Precisely that potential trap. He even mentions a stronger version of this criticism he heard from some psychologist.
Oh, what's that?
This psychologist apparently claimed Freemasons are modern Pharisees. Quoting the Bible, they love the uppermost rooms at feasts and the chief seats at the synagogue, and to be called of men, Rabbi, Rabbi.
Whoa. Comparing Masons to Pharisees? The hypocrites Jesus condemned, that is incredibly harsh.
It is. And Hungerford admits he thinks that's maybe a bit thick, over the top.
Just a bit, yeah.
But even so, he still suggests that Masons, especially the masters running the lodges, should probably read the 23rd chapter of St. Matthew. That's the chapter where Jesus really lays into the Pharisees, to kind of learn about the potential pitfalls of ritualism from history.
So even if he thinks the comparison is extreme, he includes it because there might be a kernel of truth, a warning worth hearing.
Seems like it. He acknowledges you might never meet a Mason who literally brags about being good just because he knows the ritual cold but doesn't practice the principles. But the danger of that psychological effect, he argues, is real and something to be aware of.
That makes sense. And this idea of ritual potentially becoming just rote performance or an end in itself, it connects pretty well to the next criticism, doesn't it, about how lodges were actually operating day to day.
It leads right there. Criticism number 3. Is the average lodge of thy 20th century merely a degree mill? He says this was a most frequent inside complaint, especially, he noted, in cities.
Degree mill, that just sounds negative. What's the specific complaint?
The argument was that city lodges, maybe feeling financial pressure, were focusing almost entirely on just putting candidates through the mill, rushing them through the degrees.
And why? What was the motivation?
Primarily, he suggests, to generate funds. Got to meet those Grand Lodge assessments, cover rising expenses, money.
So quantity over quality, driven by the bottom line.
That's the accusation. He even mentions a sort of competitive vibe among lodge masters trying to break records for how many new members they brought in, how much money they raised.
And did he see any fallout from this? Like, how did it affect the members?
Yeah. He mentions doing a survey or a canvass and finding a common reason people gave for not attending lodge anymore.
What was it?
It was that the constant repetition of degree ceremonials was tiresome and boring. Just sitting through the same degree work over and over again.
Yeah, I can see how that might get old if that's all that's happening.
He even shares a pretty blunt quote from someone he describes as a prominent professional man. This guy said, I would just as soon attend the sessions of a Chinese school as to sit and lodge and hear nothing but that same old stuff droned over and over again until it sounds like a mere rigmarole.
Chinese school. Okay, that's quite the comparison for perceived monotony.
Well,
Wow. Did he mention the money complaints again here?
he did. That was another frequent excuse he heard for non-attendance. People objecting to the constant fundraising, the frequent drives for money.
What was the objection?
He quotes someone comparing it to being held up for some fund or another, saying it felt like it was easier and less expensive to go out in the street and be held up by a panhandler.
Whoa. Equating a lodge fund drive to getting mugged on the street. That's intense.
It is. Hungerford himself calls that particular sentiment unmasonic in spirit, not the right attitude. But he includes it because it's a real criticism people were voicing. He felt it needed to be heard.
And he had his own take on the fundraising too, right?
Yeah, he added his own observation that some of these drives seem to have more sounding brass and tinkling cymbal, more noise and show than the actual genuine spirit of charity.
Okay, so if the focus in some lodges is just processing candidates for money, like a degree mill, does that affect the kind of members who are attracted, or maybe the ones who become most visible?
It seems Hungerford thought so. Which brings us to his fourth criticism. Do button and knife and fork members dominate numerically?
Ah, okay. This sounds like it's about superficial membership.
Exactly. He says that wherever that competitive spirit and the focus on quantity rather than quality takes hold, this criticism tends to be justified.
So what are button and knife and fork masons, according to him?
These were apparently common terms back then. Button masons were the guys whose main Masonic activity seemed to be buying and very conspicuously wearing large Masonic pins or emblems. He even jokes they like them as big as a fireman's badge.
All show, no substance, basically. It's wearing the label. And knife and fork masons?
Those were the members who, well, pretty much only showed up when there was food involved. A free feed, as he puts it.
Oh, the dinner masons.
Right. He talks about the huge popularity of the fourth degree, which was his sarcastic term for the call from labor to refreshment. The mealtime.
Like the 19th hole in golf, he said?
Exactly that comparison.
Huh.
He says some brothers seemed completely deaf to anything happening in the lodge until that call for refreshment came. Then suddenly they were all ears.
That paints a picture. Only interested when the dinner bell rings.
Yeah. Now, he does acknowledge, look, this is a common weakness of frail humanity. It's not like only Masons like a free meal.
Sure.
But he still sees it as a shortcoming and handicap for the fraternity, especially if new members aren't properly impressed that Masonry is supposed to be far more than either social or business intercourse.
Right. If the main thing they see emphasized is the pins and the meals, they might miss the deeper point entirely.
Precisely. And all this, the potential for ritual to be empty, the degree mill focus, the superficial members, it kind of culminates in the final criticism he presents. This one seems to capture a lot of that frustration, especially from a younger perspective.
Okay, this is the one with the really raw language. Criticism number 5. Are Masonic meetings devoted mainly to back-patting, blah, and bunk? The exclamation points are his, I assume.
Yes, they are. He explicitly states this one comes from a representative of the younger generation, someone working in magazines. And he includes it, even though he finds the language loose and the criticism somewhat extravagant.
Why include it then?
Because he felt it represented a fairly common point of view among many of our younger brothers at the time. He thought it was important perspective.
Okay, so let's hear the quote again. It's pretty memorable.
It is. The quote is, "I quit coming to lodge because I found that most Masonic meetings are devoted mainly to back-patting, blah, and bunk. Every lodge night, I used to go home with a pain in the neck from listening to some pompous old windbag spouting a lot of stewed bologna about the grand and glorious deeds of some other old windbag. Then, after the first hot air artist ran out of gas, the old bird who'd been all puffed up at hearing himself lied out so fluently would have to get up and hand back a big line of blah blah to the big banana oil merchant who began the palaver."
Stewed bologna. Banana oil merchant. I mean, wow, that is just incredibly blunt. It paints this picture of meetings filled with nothing but empty reciprocal flattery between, well, old windbag.
It certainly does. Painfully vivid, you might say. And Hungerford adds this interesting note for his older readers who might not get all the slang.
What does he say?
He basically tells them, if you don't understand banana oil, or blah blah, ask a younger member to translate it for you. He warns them they might get an earful about how that generation, the ones who would eventually have to carry the craft forward, really felt.
That's a sharp nudge, a call for the established guys to actually listen to the critique, even if it's phrased harshly.
Definitely. It's a plea for intergenerational understanding, maybe.
That quote really does stick with you. So after laying out these 5 pretty pointed criticisms, Hungerford kind of circles back to his original purpose, right? He wasn't just complaining.
No, not at all. He reiterates that his aim wasn't really to dissect each criticism in detail himself in that first article. It was more to arouse your interest in these problems. He wanted to spark a conversation, get people thinking and sharing their own observations or views.
So he's challenging the readers, don't just dismiss these criticisms or deny them defensively.
Right. He urges them to, frankly, face these issues, to really look at their own lodges and figure out, honestly, to what extent they are operative, right there in their own context.
And he believed that doing this, engaging with these uncomfortable questions, was actually important work.
He saw it as a real service to the craft, that fostering this kind of environment where honest self-assessment could happen was valuable, maybe even essential.
So wrapping this up, when we look back at this 1928 article, Brother Herbert Hungerford put some really significant internal critiques out there. Big questions about moral improvement.
Yeah, and the potential downside of ritualism if it's just performance without real action.
The whole degree mill concern, focusing on numbers and money over substance.
Which could lead to those button and belly masons dominating the superficial engagement.
And capped off by that stinging critique from the younger generation about meetings feeling like empty back-patting blonde bunk.
It's quite a list.
It really is. And it's honestly fascinating, isn't it, to see these specific things being debated within Masonry almost 100 years ago. Which brings it back to you, the listener. Why is looking at this old document useful? Well, what stands out to you hearing these critiques from 1928? Do they sound completely alien, like ancient history?
Or perhaps do some of them feel surprisingly familiar? Maybe echoes of discussion still happening in some corners today. It really makes you think about how institutions evolve, or maybe sometimes struggle to.
And that connects back to Hungerford's point about the acacia, right?
Yeah.
If a fraternity's strength, its vitality really lies in that ability to grow and adapt, to be always living and ever growing, then how essential is that kind of honest internal self-criticism, even the stuff that makes people uncomfortable?
It raises a big question, doesn't it? What does it truly mean for any organization, Masonic or otherwise, to embrace that idea of being always living and ever growing? How much honest critique does that require, especially in changing times? Something to definitely mull over.